Now, when you talk about hurricanes, typhoons, those strong gusty winds that comes across, that can actually help the earth to breathe even more free and make the environment more greener altogether. Now, if you look at the North Pole and the South Pole, they are primarily consisting of the ice caps because it's a completely, so what is happening is that the atmospheric temperature of the earth is constantly on an increasing mode. This will be the opposite of the rainfall. There will be no water, there will be no rainfall at all, and people will die out of the shortage of water. Good morning and welcome to the third session of disaster management, and we have been speaking about on different topics in terms of the disaster happening and what are the factors that have been determining the development aspect. Now in this session we are going to talk about the climate change adaptation, which is the most interesting topic and which is the most hot topic that has been talked across in the globe. Well, we have been deciding and we have been talking about climate change and its effects on the global scenario, but then lot of talks have only been relented towards on the theoretical development and they have not gone much into practicality. So in this session, we are going to understand what is climate change and why do we need to adapt ourselves to the coming policies of the climate change factors. Moving forward, now let me first introduce what is climate change to you. Climate change adaptation is a response to the global warming, also known as climate change. So I'm going to use this word climate change. Why? Because this adaptation word is what we are now trying to get inside. You need to adapt yourself to the current scenario and situation, which can actually help us to overcome the factor called as global warming. Now, adaptation actions can also be considered either incremental adaptation, where the central aim is to maintain the essence and integrity of the system. Now, what we are trying to talk about in climatic change is that overnight, we are not going to transform the earth. Overnight, things are not going to change both from a climate perspective, neither from a cultural perspective, nor from that of the attitude of the people. But what the governments, the different heads, and the agencies are expecting people is that you need to slowly start accepting and adapting yourself to the climatic change factors. Now, climate change is something which is more concerned about the practices, the policies, and the way we are taking care of our environment. Nowadays, what is happening is that people are trying to ignore the environment and they are trying to go more towards the technology orientation, whereby they are trying to create an harmful situation for their lives as well as for the ecosystem. So that is why I would always say that we need a transformation. We need to take it slowly, either on the incremental basis or a complete basis. Now, when I talk about the incremental basis, that means to say that we have to start stepping ourselves day by day, month by month, year by year, trying to bring in some healthy practices which can go ahead and transform the way we are living. Now, for a simple example, I would say that the ban on plastics or cutting down of forests or usage of too much of FMCG goods like the air conditioner, refrigerator, and so many other factors. This can be slowly cut down and we can start moving towards an alternative source of energy or an alternative source of material that can actually help the earth to breathe even more free and make the environment more greener altogether. Now, followed by which I would also like to talk about the transformational adaptation, actions that can change the fundamental attribute of a system in response to climate change and its impact. Now, what is a transformational factor where fundamentally we are trying to change the entire concept or we are trying to change the entire ideology that is behind the way of we are living, the way of doing things altogether. Now, let me just give you an example here. Now, 15, 20 years back in our country, we were not much adapted to air conditioners. We were not much adapted to cooling systems in our home. We were just going with the fans and the table fans altogether. But then what slowly happened is that with the growing amount of flats, very, very composed way of living, very compact way of living, and getting into the concrete jungle, slowly the temperature also started going up, and people wanted to have an adaptive cooling system that could always keep their house at a particular temperature. With this, the advent of air conditioners started going up, and what happened is that too much of power consumption, too much of chlorofluorocarbons coming into picture, and we are again trying to go back on the greenhouse gas effect. Now, in the earlier days, people used to cool down their houses by putting straws around their house and pouring water on it, which would in turn reduce the climatic effect, which would reduce the temperature, so that the people living inside could have a much more cooler atmosphere. Similarly, by planting trees around your home, you could probably lessen the temperature around the surroundings so that you could live in much more cooler atmosphere. Now, this is where the fundamental attribute or a shift that comes into picture. Now, one side, if you want to look for an alternative for a cooling system, you could go for a fan or an air cooler. Of course, yes, because now you are trying to reduce the consumption of power, or you are trying to look into an alternative sources. But fundamentally, if you want to change your ideology, you want to go and you really want to make a difference, that means you have to go back to the traditional methods. You have to find out a way by which things can be made even more simpler for the people to live in. So that is why transformation is all about changing the attitude, changing the values, changing the principles of our living. If we are able to do so, if we are able to build our knowledge, if we are able to build our awareness to that level, automatically we can overcome the climatic change effects and we can live an effective life altogether. Now, moving forward, the climate change and the effects of global warming. I would like to talk about global warming very, very clearly and important. Why? Because global warming is the major factor what most of the nations in the world are trying to fight about, and they take it as a very, very serious effect or an impact that has been happening on our Mother Earth. Now, global warming is the slow increase of average temperature on the Earth's atmosphere because an increased amount of energy, that is heat, striking on the Earth from the sun is being trapped through the atmosphere and not radiated out into the space. Now, you look into the entire definition, the entire concept altogether. The Earth being here and the sun being here, the entire radiations that are coming from the sun is directly hitting onto the Earth. So this is the Earth. Now what is happening is that the surface of the Earth, the outer space, is getting heated up by the constant radiations from the sun. So what is happening is that the atmospheric temperature of the Earth is constantly on an increasing mode. Now, we do not have a way through which these rays can be taken back into the space. When I try to say that taken back, which means they can be reflected back or thrown back into the space altogether. So the Earth has been absorbing all the rays that are coming from the sun directly, and because of which what is happening is the land temperature has been constantly increasing. Now that is a cause of worry for each one of us today, because every time this happens in our situation, in our atmosphere, this can lead to a very, very serious situation altogether. So that's why we need to be very, very cautious about this factor. Next one, the most common and the most talked about green gas effect, that is the CO2 or carbon dioxide. In fact, it is because so common, scientists use it as a benchmark to measure things that warm the atmosphere. Now, what is happening is that because of the interim effect, that is the heat rays coming and falling directly on the Earth's atmosphere. The chances of the carbon emissions and the greenhouse gas effect going up is definitely a very big concern for all of us. So what is going to happen is that this effect is not going to be easily looked into, but this effect is going to cause a lot of chances and challenges for the Earth's temperature to start going up and the greenhouse gas effect coming into picture. So most of the scientists are worried about this factor. They really want to know what could be the actual alternatives that could go on and reduce the effect of the temperature going up. So that is why this is where we are going to go and talk about this greenhouse gas effect, which is actually causing a lot of problem to the Earth's temperature. Now, the Earth is trying to take in all this direct rays, and you could have seen that possibly in the last 10 or 15 years, the temperature of the Earth has been constantly on an increase, and we are not feeling colder these days. There has been an indirect heat which is directly coming into the picture, and every single house, every single state, city, village, or even the hill stations are not being able to retain a cooler temperature or atmosphere altogether. Now, moving forward, when we talk about the effects of the climate change, what are the effects of the climate change? The climate change impacts rising sea level. That's a very, very important thing that we are talking about. Now, if you look at the North Pole and the South Pole, they are primarily consisting of the ice caps, because it's a completely ice zone which has got storage of all big ice which have been just formed as rocks there. Now, all these ice caps have started melting. Those icebergs have started melting, which is directly actually impacting in terms of the rise of the sea levels. So all the sea levels will start rising up, and we would have seen that the average sea level around the world rose about 8 inches. That's about 20 centimeter in the past 100 years. Now, we might say that what is 20 centimeter all about? It's hardly about a foot long or a half foot long scale all about. But then let me tell you very seriously, 20 centimeter, the water going up, already the Earth has got 97% water and only 3% land. Now, when the water content level starts going up, that means the rising sea levels start going up. That means it's a direct warning to each one of us that the land surrounding the sea will be completely drowned. So this is a very, very serious warning. This is a very, very important message that each one of us need to understand. The rising sea level can cause a serious damage to the Earth and to the ecosystem. Followed by projections suggest that the climate change impacts within the next 100 years, if not sooner, God forbidden, and by all kinds of measure, the world's glaciers would have disappeared, which means to say that within next century, we would see that there would be no more ice left around the Earth, and all the ice would have melted and formed water, which means definitely the sea levels would start going up, and that would lead to the drowning of most of the countries. Plus, this would also lead to a very, very serious impact for the animals living in the polar region, like the penguin, the polar bear, the sea lion, the Arctic birds, and all those factors would completely get disappeared because of the overheating effect or because of the climate impact changes, especially because of global warming coming into picture. So it is the right time for each one of us to think and act properly so that we are able to protect the Earth and we are able to stop the Earth from getting drowned. Moving forward, the effects of climate change would also come into picture when the specific conditions that produce rainfall will not change, and the climate change impacts amount to water in atmosphere and will increase producing violent downpours instead of steady showers altogether. We have been increasingly getting into the picture of violent showers not only in India but in many parts of the world. What is the reason behind it? We have to know. The reason behind it is that because of the global warming, you can see that there has been a lot of precipitation that has been happening around the atmosphere, and the collection of water droplets in the clouds have started going up to a very great extent. So there might be a possibility, there might be a chance where you might experience a cloud burst, or you might experience a scenario when there is just a gush of water out of the heaven, out of the blue altogether. So that is where we would like to understand, we would like to go about trying to see that the specific conditions are happening primarily because there has been an atmospheric change, and that atmospheric change is causing them a great worry altogether. Now, hurricanes and typhoons will increase in power, flooding will become more common. So this is another part of our worrying picture altogether. Now, when we talk about hurricanes, typhoons, those strong gusty winds that comes across with a lot of power, they can create damage to human beings as well as to the assets and properties, which will lead to a very, very bad scenario altogether. Why is this happening? Is because most of the hurricanes or the typhoons are directly related to the rising water level, which causes an even more stronger wave, stronger wind orientation, and they carry a larger power. They sweep across the city or villages or all these nations, and they can cause a devastating effect on the human life altogether. So these are the factors which we are being studying, and we need to look into it. At some point of time, this should not happen in our daily walk of life, or else our life cannot be guaranteed. Now, moving forward, I would also like to talk about the effects of climate change in terms of the downpours one side, and also about the droughts and famine. Despite downpours in some areas, droughts have become very prolonged, and heat waves have also become very, very common. Now, you can see that in some parts of India, especially towards Rajasthan, in the northern parts of Delhi and Haryana, there has been a lot of heat waves that have been generated, which has led to continuous famines and continuous shortage of water, by which agriculture, human beings, plants and animals have got worstly affected. Now, this is one of the reasons where I would like to bring in a contradiction of what we were speaking in the previous slide. One side, there is going to be heavy rainfall, there is going to be a heavy downpour, which is going to cause a severe damage or an effect on the lives of people. The other side, you see that the heat waves are becoming common. They are becoming something which is trying to affect us, which is trying to go across and trying to hit us altogether. Now, if the heat waves go on, this will be the opposite of the rainfall. There will be no water, there will be no rainfall at all, and people will die out of the shortage of water. Rising temperatures are hardly surprising. That's what most of the scientists, most of the people are saying in this world. Why is that? Because although they don't mean that some parts of the world will not enjoy record cold temperatures and terrible winter storms, heating disturbs the entire global weather, and the system can shift to a cold upper air circuit currents as well as hot dry ones. Single snowballs or snowstorms do not make any change refutations. Now, if you look into it, drastic climate changes can cause a complete destruction of the human life cycle. Certain places, like let's say about the European countries, the northern European parts, which have been extremely influenced by the cold climate, and they remain cold throughout the year. Now, all of a sudden, because of the climatic changes and the effect, there might be a sudden change in their weather. The terrible cold weather will go away, and suddenly they will start experiencing deep summers altogether. Or in the cases where there has been a severe summer effect, that could change into a colder zone altogether. Now, what is happening is that the shift in climate, the shift in the changes in the patterns of weather will cause the earth go movement in a wrong manner altogether. This can affect the lifestyle of the people, this can affect the lifestyle of the business, the nature, environment, and added to the part that most of the animals living in the ecosystem will get completely disturbed, and they might have to lose their lives. So that is why we are talking about this climatic change factors in a long way, in a most elaborate manner so that everybody in this world takes it up seriously and join hands together in terms of providing a better solution for this world to live in. Now, moving forward, the other effect of a climatic change is that as the world warms up, now when the temperature goes up, the entire ecosystem will move. Now, this is quite surprising for each one of us to understand. Can an ecosystem move? Can the nature make a movement by itself? Now, that's a very big question mark that we need to ask ourselves. And the answer to it, surprisingly, is yes. So the ecosystem itself will move. The ecosystem itself will depart from what it was altogether. Already, the rising temperature at the equator have pushed staple crops like rice north once into cooler areas, and many fish species have migrated long distance to stay in waters that have proper temperature for them. Now look at that. One single shift in terms of the climatic changes has gone into the factor that, even staple food factors like rice have to be shifted to some other zone, and the aquatic animals that have been living under the sea have now started experiencing difficulties in terms of this changes that has been taking place. So now what is happening is that the fishes have started gliding and moving away to the waters which have got a stable temperature so that their lifestyle or their living conditions are not affected. Now you can see that a minimum increase in temperature itself can have this much of effect. Now, if we talk about prolonged effective temperature or temperatures coming inside, could also start getting into a different factor or a different scenario altogether. Once in colder waters, this may increase fishermen's catches. In warmer waters, it may eliminate fishing. So one side, when we are talking about the fishing as a profession going up, the other side, the fishermen will be left without any fishes because the water is getting warmer. Moment the water starts getting warmer, it will eliminate fishing altogether. Now you can see that a climatic change is bringing in a change in occupation. It is trying to affect the occupation of the people altogether. So that is why it is very, very important that we start understanding what are the factors in terms of making the global warming reduced to maximum effect as far as possible. Now, if you look at the east coast of US, it will require fishermen to go further to reach fishing grounds. Now, that's a very, very important factor. Now, what will happen there is that since the coastal areas are getting warmer, the fishes might move away from the coast and they might have gone to further waters. So now what the fishermen have to do is that they might have to go into deeper waters in order to penetrate and get the fish altogether. So fishing itself would become very, very difficult, and the livelihoods of fishermen who are dependent on this would also come into trouble. So down the lane, climatic change and the effects of it are going to be severe for the mankind. Now, going forward, we are also going to talk about the effects of climate change, and one of the most striking part of it is the rising temperature felt in global agriculture. Now, agriculture, as we know, is the livelihood. It's the lifeline for all of us, because without food, none of us can survive in the world. But what is going to be the impact of the climate change on agriculture? Now, if you see that very largely different temperate developed world and in more tropical developing world. So now what is going to happen is these impacts are going to be felt under different conditions. So the crops that are going to be developed by the farmer is no more going to be the same. There is going to be a shift in terms of production. There is going to be a shift in terms of the quantity, that is the output, and also the quality of crops can also get damaged. So now what is going to happen is that earlier people were growing some type of vegetables or rice or a particular variety of agriculture that was happening in certain zones of this world. Now, because of the climatic change, they might have to shift the place, or they might have to change the style of crop that they are already growing. So the crops would become completely damaged because of this climatic change. Second thing, different crops grow best in specific temperatures. Now, let me say that for a coffee plantation, you need to have a climate which is colder, which has got a water precipitate, which has got a raining climate altogether. But then you cannot grow coffee in Rajasthan because of the climatic changes, because of the climatic conditions there. But then what is going to happen here is that if the climate changes in those hill stations, automatically we will not be able to grow coffee and tea. And similarly, if the climate changes in the coastal areas, the fishing will also get affected. So what is happening is that the lifestyle of people, the profession of the people also comes under question mark. A slight change in the climatic factor can lead into drastic effects altogether. Followed by, in North America, rising temperatures may reduce corn and wheat productivity. Now, this is also a serious factor. Why? Because corn and wheat are some staple food which are being consumed by every person in America, which has been a staple food across the Western countries and also in some of the Eastern countries also. Now, what is going to happen is that because of the climatic change that is happening in US Midwest, the production of corn and related items are going to come down, which is going to affect the lifestyle of people, also the farmers who are engaged in that. Followed by the productivity of rice, the staple food for more than 1/3 of the world population, declines by 10% with every 1 degree increase in temperature. Now look at it. 33% of this world population survive on rice. Now, if there is going to be an increase in temperature, automatically there is going to be a 10% decline in rice production. So which is going to affect the people to a very great extent. The food and the living conditions are affected because of climatic changes, then there will be no survival anymore left on the earth. So every single change on the climate factor will have a direct impact on the lives of the people. So that is why we need to spend time, we need to get serious, we need to think about these factors and start building a safer ecosystem for us to live and for our generations to come forward. Now, moving forward, I would also like to talk about the word called as adaption or the adaptation altogether. For the adaption, what we are going to talk about is that the United Nations Framework Convention had come up with the International Adaptation Finance. This is primarily because it incorporates a financial mechanism for the country parties to support them with the adaptation, which means to say that we are trying to bring in funds specially for the Special Climate Change Fund and the Least Development Countries Fund, which is going to actually help the countries to overcome all these factors. And they have come up with funds like COP15 and COP16, which has been administered by its own secretariat. Now, in the Kyoto Protocol, which was an operation, the Adaptation Fund was financed by a 2% levy on clean development mechanism. Now, if you can see that United Nations, with the effort of other countries, started pulling in money, and they wanted to develop the country. They wanted people to understand about the different effects of the financial matters, about the different effects in terms of the growth altogether. They wanted to protect the country. They wanted to give money for people and for the nation so that they are able to protect themselves. They are able to rebuild the nation. They are able to come across the policies of adaptation. So based on that, they came up with a Special Climatic Change Fund, and they came up with some funds which are particularly administered by their own system, and they are giving it to the poor and the weaker nations so that they are also able to overcome the climatic change and move forward in terms of development. Now, moving forward, The adaptation is also going to be about the policies that we are going to look into it. The adaptive policy can occur at global, national or local scale, with the outcome dependent on the political will in that area. Now, this is very, very important. How is the government of a country trying to receive or reciprocate about the adaptation policy altogether? Now, when we talk about North Korea in particular, for an example, North Korea has been running on a dictatorship. They have been trying to concentrate more on missile development rather than looking into climate change policies. So now what is happening to the government here is that they are slightly fearing that North Korea would be the first country to trigger another third world war. Whereas on the other side, if you look at countries like India, which has been trying to talk about peace treaties, or when you look at countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Poland, France, all these countries have been spending huge amount of money in terms of conserving the nature, in terms of preserving the ecosystem and making it even more a better livable place altogether. So what I want to concentrate, what I want to really point out here is that the political will of the government, the political will of the nation does definitely matter in terms of understanding and adapting the policy towards growth. Followed by, there had been two great researchers named as the Sugar and Gramsci, who were trying to identify the 9 fundamental principles which are considered to be the basis for adaptation, which are included with the effects of climate change, varying by region to region, demographies to demography, and the effectiveness. So they had come out with a 9 principle manner in order to adapt and take forward this situation. Both the researchers made it very clear that climate change policy is impeded by a high level of variance surrounding the climate change impacts, as well as the diverse nature of the problem they face. Why? Because when you talk about this climate change, when you talk about these factors very clearly, every country has got a very, very diverse nature, has got a very diverse factor in terms of the demography and the way they are living. Probably the climatic conditions that exist in Sweden is not the same climatic condition that exist in Afghanistan. So that means to say that the countries will have their own demographic factor that actually looks into the matter, that actually comes into picture. So people have to think about it. People have to make it even more composite, even more better altogether, so that the conditions in which they adapt, in the conditions in which they are going to follow, should be reasonable, should be acceptable, and should be growth oriented altogether. Now, moving forward, the types of adaptation has been spoken about in this level: installing protective and resilient technologies, especially in order to stop flooding; change to heat tolerant tree varieties which can take the heat absorption altogether; rainwater storage systems, so that everywhere in every building we start getting into rainwater harvesting, which is a very, very important topic, especially in India, where there are a lot of high-rise flats, where there are a lot of big societies that have been built. So every single society, every single organization, buildings have been told that they need to invest time, money and energy in rainwater harvesting. That's very, very important. Followed by reducing paved areas to deal with rainwater and heat, so that you could probably drive that rainwater back to the ground, adding green roofs to deal with rainwater and heat, so that the climatic conditions could be managed well within the house. Followed by adding air conditioning in public schools. Now, for government schools, we are trying to bring in air conditioning factors so that you can bring in a stable atmosphere there, requiring waterfront properties for higher foundations, so that you could probably resist the water development there, so you can have a better outlook. It will also help the nature and the ecosystem to survive there. Moving forward, with this, we come to the conclusion of this session. I hope and believe that this session was highly interesting, useful, and informative. In the next session, we will be trying to understand about the various factors of the climate change adaptations and the other systems that are prevalent in disaster management. Until then, Stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me today.